It's a full house. As a colleague of mine was saying that you mentioned China in any discussion, you are assured of a full house.
That's Pakistan, I thought.
I think we have moved on, you know. And if
you mention Mr. SHASHI THAROOR, then also.
Of course, yeah. And this report is sort of, you know, it deals with a lot of issues. I did a quick count, and there were at least as many as 13 broad issues that it's looking at. It's looking at broad how India should engage with China. It is looking at India's defense ties with China, India's policy on Taiwan, India's approach to Taiwan, and China's engagement in India's neighborhood, and how should India look at it. Should it be a containment policy or an entire, what should India do in Southeast Asia? India's approach to what China is doing in CPEC, Doklam. There is something on Bhutan as well. Boundary issues, special representative process, how strong and how durable it is. India's trade ties, why it is going astray. India and China's economic cooperation on international forum. So I think there's nothing that is left out. So we have a sort of very comprehensive report in front of us, and we have the chairman of that committee, which authored this report with us. So what we'll do is this, the next half an hour or so, and we will have Mr. Mohammed Salim to join us, and Mr. Narasimhan, a defense expert, is also with us here. So what we'll do this is that we will have Mr. Tharoor's wisdom on what he saw as the relationship and the committee's brief was, and give us his understanding of how things can go forward.
Sure.
And then we'll go to Mr. Narasimhan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Bhattacharya. As far as the committee is concerned, we've actually had a very productive 5 years, I'm very pleased to say, in that we have come up with a few landmark reports on Indian foreign policy, which after their adoption are public documents and therefore stand, I hope, as significant markers in the evolution of parliamentary understanding of and analysis of Indian foreign policy. I would particularly draw your attention to a pretty sort of landmark report on the Indian Foreign Service, its recruitment, training, deployment patterns, and potential reforms. There is also a solid and I think unprecedented report on India's soft power and cultural diplomacy, some of the suggestions of which the government seems to have taken on board. And we have had two significant reports on bilateral relationships, one on Pakistan the previous year, which I'm pleased to say continues to read well in the absence of any significant development in that relationship since the report was tabled. And then most recently now, a couple of months ago, the report on India-China relations with, of course, a specific reference to the Doklam crisis, which of course happened to arise at a time when we were considering the subject anyway. Now, these reports, I just want to add one more sentence and I'll go to the specific subject before us. These reports were all adopted unanimously by the committee, of whose membership the BJP has a majority. As in all committees, the committees are constituted by members of parliament roughly in proportion to their strength in the two houses. Remember, unlike, say, the US system where you have the House International Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, in India we have one committee for both houses of parliament. And in this, there is clearly a BJP majority, but no dissent note has been recorded under my chairmanship, a fact of which I'm very proud. We have worked towards consensus, we've worked towards common ground. The report, the process of arriving at the report is the following. In the case of this particular China report, we held 7 different hearings, most of which were with the Foreign Secretary. Some included representatives of other ministries, the Defense Secretary on 3 or 4 occasions, the Home Secretary on 2 or 3 occasions, because the BSF and so on, the paramilitaries come under the Home Secretary. And on one occasion, the Chief of the Army, or rather the Vice Chief of the Army, spoke for the Army on that occasion. And then we also had one session with experts on India-China relations, including 3 former ambassadors of India to China who had retired and were free to speak their mind, and one retired military expert on satellite technology. So the committee was very thoroughly briefed. Many of these briefings took place even as the Doklam crisis was in the process of unfolding. And so the committee's deliberations perhaps got more, shall we say, dramatic media attention than they intrinsically deserve. We did our very best to keep all of these processes confidential until such time as the report is tabled in Parliament. And I can't say we had 100% success. Various colleagues, for various political reasons, found it useful to leak selectively from our discussions. But broadly speaking, the process remained more or less the way it was. And at the very end, there was a very messy play out in the media of the MEA, initially the BJP and subsequently the MEA allegedly objecting to a draft of the report. Now, let me stress that the report is not shown in draft to the government of India. It is only seen by them after it is placed on the table. However, the report always includes a narrative summary of statements made by witnesses to the committee, and those summaries are given to those who are being quoted for their confirmation that the quotes are accurate. It was this, that is, the narratives submitted to the MEA of statements made by the Foreign Secretary himself and by MEA officials, that created this particular kerfuffle. And as soon as it needlessly became a political controversy, I was able to nip it in the bud by just visiting the foreign minister myself and saying to her, look, this is silly. You could have picked up the phone and called me. What's the problem? And she explained what the problem was, that some things had been said in perhaps an indiscreet fashion to the committee that were meant only for the committee's consumption, and that seeing them in a public document would embarrass the government. I said that is a concern that is entirely legitimate, and I'll be very happy to have many of these things redacted, with just a sort of sentence saying that the committee was briefed on, shall we say, Bhutan's relations with China, without going into any perception by our government of what those relationships were like. And with that, the report stands. But I want to stress that the report that is available on the Lok Sabha website is in every respect the committee's report, and that whereas portions of the narrative summary of testimony heard may be somewhat, shall we say, skimpier than originally drafted, not one sentence in the analysis or the conclusions, which are the committee's own, has in any way been touched. I'm sorry for that extensive preliminary, because it was important, since many of you will have seen bits and pieces in the media, to make it very clear that that was the process. And in fact, despite that unseemly controversy, the report actually stands by itself. It is completely authentic to what the committee wished to say, and it is indeed, it enjoys the backing of all members of the committee without exception. Now, what is the report about? The report is broadly looking at India-China relations, but it specifically, because of the timing of its study, is dominated by the Doklam crisis. The Doklam crisis, as you know, is not strictly speaking directly a crisis involving the India-China border. It is a dispute involving territory that we and the Bhutanese consider to be Bhutanese, and the Chinese claim is Chinese. So it's actually a Bhutan-China dispute. But in view of our security relationship with Bhutan, we got directly involved. Now, the fact is that as far as India is concerned, there is a tri-junction that we wish to see both sides respect. However, the Chinese have a different perception of where the 3 borders meet than we have. And it is here that the problem arose. But the problem that was particularly worrying for us was that while there had always been an area of disputed territory that the Chinese claimed was theirs and the Bhutanese claimed was theirs, and no one made too much of a fuss about sort of modest levels of Chinese incursions into over the years. This time, for the first time, there was a very significant new incursion, which for the first time included bulldozers and other earth-moving equipment, with a very clear intention of beginning the construction of a road. But a road to where? Essentially, even if you were to accept the proposition that this was China's territory, which we don't, even in the context of Chinese territory, it was a road to nowhere. There was nothing, no population group, no strategic asset, no landmark, anything to justify the construction of a road, except one thing, which is that road would have led to the edge of the territory that China claims as its own, which overlooks the Jamperi Ridge, the one thing that separates that part of Bhutan from the narrow strip of land that connects West Bengal to the northeast. So, from our point of view, the only possible reason to construct this road had to be a malign one. That the only reason you would need that road is one day in the event of war, if you want to shell the road connecting West Bengal to the northeast or interdict it, rather like the Pakistanis in Kargil, that's the only conceivable purpose this can serve. So we immediately sensed that there was a malign intention behind this construction, and our soldiers moved quickly to stop it. Of course, we didn't claim we were doing it on Indian territory. We said we were doing it in defense of Bhutan's territorial sovereignty and in pursuance of the Indo-Bhutanese Treaty. Now, as you all know, the discussions that took place in several rounds in Beijing finally diffused the crisis. The Chinese pulled back their bulldozers. The crisis is not fully over in the sense that though the Chinese have pulled back from the face-off point, they are still in a part of the plateau known as North Doklam. And what is more, they have installed fairly permanent-looking structures there, which will enable them to station and provision a much larger number of people than they have ever historically done. So that clearly they're keeping their powder dry, as it were, for a future opportunity. And the committee's report very specifically underscores the importance of India being equally prepared. There are some strong language used by the committee, which I must say was inspired by our own visits to the area. I should have mentioned that when I talked about the witnesses. We also had those members who were willing to come, and in the end only 7 or 8 did. We also had a visit to the front lines, both in Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh, in Sikkim. We went to Nathula, and we got briefings from the military in all these spots. And we saw as much as we could see in the icy wastes. In fact, at one point in Nathula, we actually spoke to some Chinese soldiers patrolling on their side. They didn't say anything back, but they sort of pointed their cameras at us and took pictures. So that shows that the relationship is not that badly off as perhaps some of us might fear.
Did you visit Bhutan also? No.
We didn't visit Bhutan on this particular exercise. But there were other reasons. As you know, the parts of Bhutan we can fly to, whether Gangtok or Thimphu, etc., are far, far away from the area of interest. The Doklam is actually right adjoining Sikkim. In fact, there was a particular spot we had arranged to go to from which we could overlook the area where the face-off occurred, but to our bad luck, on that morning, the visibility was zero. Actually, we climbed up the mountain in the army jeeps and saw for ourselves. You couldn't see from here to where that camera is positioned. It was just terrible. So there was no point in going, because it would have meant a 7 or 8 hour drive from Gangtok to get to that spot. Yeah. And we wouldn't have been able to see anything. So, so we abandoned that particular portion. But the briefings we got were very thorough, and I must credit the army, not merely because General Narasimhan is sitting here, for their extreme professionalism. Their tremendous sense of esprit de corps, morale, confidence, and professionalism. And the briefings we got, illustrated by obviously a lot of classified satellite imagery and so on, gave us a very good sense of what they were talking about, and we found their assurances fairly credible. I must say, for example, that one of the suggestions had been that the Chinese were building the road anyway on a different route, and they disabused us of that fear. Saying that they were monitoring all these areas carefully and this anxiety was not there. So we have strongly recommended that we should severely upgrade our border infrastructure. Our roads, frankly, are an embarrassment on our side. They're extremely impressive on the other side. And I think that if you were to talk frankly to the army personnel, they'll tell you how much the rather modest infrastructure on our side impedes their movements, their mobility in the event of a future crisis. And I think it's important that the government now be proactive. We have let a few years go by, and I blame both governments equally on this. The time has now come, the committee feels, to really go on a very, very serious level of commitment to strengthen our border infrastructure. The other observations on India-China relations are relatively, shall we say, unremarkable or uncontroversial. Nothing there to surprise anybody here, which is why I don't want to use the rest of my time in summarizing all of that. But if you have specific questions on aspects of the relationship, I'll be happy to answer them. But broadly speaking, since Mr. Bhattacharya also mentioned the special representatives dialogue, we do feel it hasn't really gone anywhere. And we feel that it is in India's interest to try and move the process of the border settlement. These unresolved border issues needlessly provide opportunities to provocateurs on the other side to stir up crises like the Doklam crisis. China has settled its borders with pretty much every one of its neighbors. It has even accepted the McMahon Line when it comes to Burma, to Myanmar. Somehow we are the only country with which there is an unresolved land border. They have their maritime disputes in the South China Sea. That's another issue. And I think we should really talk to the Chinese quite seriously, because they have the slightly complacent attitude that these are things that are difficult to solve and that we should leave it to future generations. Well, leaving it to future generations, unfortunately, creates a situation in which we are going to basically be vulnerable to periodic crises of this nature. And that surely is not in the interest of Indian foreign policy, nor can it be to our advantage to give a sort of permanent strategic lever to those elements in the Chinese establishment, military or civilian, that occasionally want to throw India off balance. It's a rather pointless thing. So I think for us, this ought to be more of a priority than it has been. These fitful years of dialogue over a period of a generation now, starting in the early 90s, have really not made any significant progress. Indeed, the one thing that we thought we had agreed was a bunch of principles that the two special representatives agreed upon in 91 or 92. And those sets of principles included, for example, the principle that neither side wished to create any arrangement that would disturb settled populations, which India perhaps unwisely interpreted as meaning that was the end of the Arunachal Pradesh matter. But in fact, as you know, China has since reasserted its claims to Arunachal Pradesh on the logic that the settled populations would not be disturbed, they would simply become Chinese, which is not quite what India thought was intended by that principle. So even that one accomplishment does not seem to be one that's particularly durable. I think I'll leave it there, Mr. Bhattacharya. Here, General Narasimhan as well, and then we could engage in whatever questions you and the audience.
General Narasimhan, please. Your take on this report?
Just about a week back when I got the message that I was to come and speak here, first thing I did was to download that report. Yeah. And then went through it word by word. The committee has done a wonderful job, so I must compliment you on that, basically because the kind of work that has been put in is very visible in that report.
Thank you.
And the kind of pain that you have taken to visit those areas to get a feedback is another good thing that has happened there. The report itself is organized in 4 parts. The first one talks about the overview, second one talks about Doklam, third one talks about the boundary dispute, and the fourth one talks about the relationship in the multilateral kind of a scenario. As far as the overview is concerned, there are about 6 recommendations which have come out of that particular section. There are total 19 recommendations which the committee has made. There are a few issues I thought I'll flag it. I mean, I would like to seek your views on that because I don't know the background to which these things have happened. One is on this collaborative and the competitive kind of a relationship that we have with China. The Foreign Secretary statements in the report are very clearly visible on that. And the committee had recommended actually to segregate this collaborative and competitive elements of this relationship and then deal with them on their merits separately. My understanding was it was already being done in some form. I don't know why this report came. You must be having some more inputs on this to tell us about. Second thing also on the defense exchanges, there was a recommendation that was made to say that we should be proactively giving them the defense exchange plans, etc., proposals, etc., and not wait for them to actually initiate these issues. I think that process was again on in some form. There are a lot of proposals which have gone to the other side, which have been pending for a long time with them, and some proposals have been pending with us. It's an ongoing kind of a process that was going on at that point in time. And the third issue was on our relationship with Taiwan, I see in that report again. I think off late, the business relationship has been picking up a little bit. We have seen Foxconn and others coming into the mobile sector, the iPhone sector mainly. Some aspects of issues are picking up, and some complaints have come that some waivers have to come, etc. I think that needs to be taken care of in some form. As far as there was one recommendation on the connectivity part of it, that we should be open for bilateral cooperation to improve connectivity between India and China. That is something that I would like to seek your mind a little more on that. Maybe that will give us a little more insight into what was the thinking of the committee into this particular thing. There was also a mention about the China-Pakistan economic corridor and the reasons for India not actually taking part in that summit which took place. And incidentally, another summit is going to take place in April this year. And it appears that there may be some kind of tweaking of this entire BRI concept, basically because of the pushbacks that the committee also has observed and mentioned in this report. Initially, India was alone, but I think more and more voices are joining to take this issue back to China to say that they should be more accommodative and more open and transparent in dealing with all these things. As far as Doklam is concerned, I think the report has absolutely perfectly covered all the aspects. It has taken on board the representation done by the Foreign Secretary, etc. And it has actually commended the entire government as well as the army for that, and also suggested some measures to improve the infrastructure, improve the surveillance techniques, etc. I think that are quite fair about the whole thing, and that's what we need to do in any case on these issues. On the boundary dispute, there was some, I had only one observation on this. Most of the things are generally on the lines on which we have been seeing on ground, and I think after the report has been submitted, some more progress has been done on ground on these issues. So one thing I just wanted to seek your mind was on comprehensive border engagement agreement. My observation was we already have enough systems in place, starting from 93 agreement, 96 agreement, 2003 agreement, 2005 agreement, 2012, 2013. We have already enough number of agreements in place. I think the solution lies in actually implementing them correctly than to go for an extra agreement, which will only probably add to the numbers, but effectiveness may be questionable at some point in time. The other issue is on there is an interesting observation by the committee which I saw on how Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, if the alignments are tweaked and the measurements are tweaked, which can be used for also defense purposes. That is a very interesting observation, I thought, given by the committee on this, which is a fair one. But I think instead of the Ministry of Defense, I think mostly it should be the Home Ministry which deals with the border area management, which could probably come into play along with Ministry of Defense to do this. On the multilateral cooperation and cooperation in the multilateral institute and other issues, our understanding, at least my understanding was that till about the 2007-8 era, I think China was going hand in hand with India on many of these multilateral propositions. They used to discuss and then get into a common kind of an understanding and then go for that. But that thing changed after a while. And to that extent, I think the committee has already noticed it and see what needs to be done on that, actually speaking. And the scope for another interesting phenomena which I noticed in this report is the scope for cooperation in the field of cleaning of rivers, agriculture, including dairy and fisheries. That's a very interesting kind of a recommendation that was made by the committee. And I think these are actually ways and means of improving the relationship, whereas we have our issues with China. I'm sure everybody knows it. But I think there is an effort to say that both cooperation and competition should go hand in hand. But one thing I think the report did not cover, maybe it was beyond the mandate or maybe didn't look into it, is basically how we leverage our soft power in terms of cultural exchanges, in terms of youth exchanges, in terms of other issues that we could have done. That is something probably the committee could have looked into. These are my observations, sir. Anything else I can?
Why don't you respond to some of these questions?
These are very good points, and particularly on the last one, the soft power one, I'm myself amazed that we left that out, because clearly it's an obvious area. There are vast areas of ignorance about India in China, and indeed comparable, but perhaps slightly less areas of ignorance about China in India. When we talked about connectivity, it also included, for example, the startling paucity of flights between our major cities. There are also land routes going back to the pre-colonial era, which could be revived in many parts, and which in fact have been disused or unused now for decades, that could be picked up. And there is actually some informal smuggling and that sort of thing taking place already, which we could easily rationalize and make something more serious of. When you get out there, you realize how challenging the terrain is in any case to police and monitor. One thinks of these two countries as potentially implacable, sworn sort of militarized enemies, but the fact is that between them, there are large tracts of land where people can and do comfortably slip across without sometimes even being conscious that they moved to a different country. So there are definitely opportunities for enhanced both land and air connectivity than we have been taking advantage of. On the General's point about collaboration and competition, we've suggested that there are perhaps more areas of collaboration that could be explored. One point, for example, that struck me personally is that when it comes to the sea lanes of communication from the Gulf and East Africa to India and beyond, we and China actually have the identical interest. We want to see those sea lanes open because goods come to India through those lanes. The Chinese want to see those open because goods come to China from there, past India, up towards the Straits of Malacca and so on. Mind you, now they may be trying to try a different route via Gwadar instead, but at least until that becomes totally operational, this is still of great interest to the Chinese. We've never somehow collaborated, for example, on something like the Somali pirates and the anti-piracy patrols. There was no formal effort for India and China to even consider joint patrols or synchronized or coordinated activity in those waters. The kind of thing that we simply did not explore and the Chinese clearly did not seek to explore. There was one accidental collaboration. That's right. When I think a Thai trawler was taken over by pirates, and an Indian aircraft and a Chinese ship, or the other way around, interceded. But somehow that was done without the accompanying diplomacy, and so the Chinese actually gave us no credit, though the Indian media reported that particular episode. I would argue that there's a lot more that can be done, but at the same time, we have to also find ways of communicating our displeasure when the Chinese act directly contrary to our vital interests. See, we don't do anything that's against the direct national interests of China. They frequently act against our direct national interests. In particular, they are the only member of the UN Sanctions Committee that for several years now has thwarted the blacklisting of Masood Azhar and other Pakistani terrorists whose complicity in acts of terror in India is beyond doubt. The 14 other countries, including the US, have voted to sanction those individuals by name, and China has absolutely stood its ground. Now, this can't be anything but a hostile act, because surely China is not interested in encouraging terrorism in Pakistan, because bits and pieces of that have washed over into their backyard in the Uyghur territories of Western China, and they should surely have some common interest with us in curbing these hotheads out of Pakistan. But sadly, they have not done so. And I think it's a pity that we don't perhaps do enough in terms of, if we had more positive things we were doing with them, we would have things that would be interrupted that they would value. Whereas right now there is not that much, and therefore there's not much you can threaten them with.
That's right.
One of the reasons that the committee deliberately made a bit of a fuss about the Taiwan relationship in the report, which has been unmentionable so far, I mean not so far today, but so far for many years, is precisely that we feel we need to start leveraging some things we have that the Chinese can be needled by, because at the moment the needling is all one way. They needle us, we bear the pinpricks, and we do occasionally bleed. On defense exchanges, I agree with General Narasimhan, there are a fair amount of exchanges happening already, and there's always some little feel-good news clip that many of you may miss of Chinese soldiers singing Bollywood songs at a drunken gathering with Indian soldiers one evening and that sort of stuff. These things do happen once in a while. Yeah. So all of that occurs, but I think what we were saying was that if there was more sort of routine levels of exchanges between the two sides, the defense personnel and the comprehensive border engagement idea was also about that, then you might not have had a situation like Doklam or the earlier situation in 2014 when the PLA came across the border during President Xi Jinping's visit to Narendra Modi and actually pitched tents on that side. I mean, that sort of thing suggests a lack of dialogue or a lack of connection, lack of conversation that we felt could have been avoided. On the CPEC, our fundamental objection initially was only about the sovereignty issue. We said China itself recognized that this is disputed territory. How on earth can you then build a road through disputed territory without consulting the party with whom the dispute exists? So for us, therefore, it was again an unwarrantedly hostile act, and we absolutely refused to countenance any involvement in that. And I think most self-respecting nations would take the stand we've taken. There was no dissent in the committee about endorsing the government's view that we should not participate in that. In fact, the only feeling that some of us had, though I don't think it's in the report if I remember right, he said, well, why didn't we think of offering the Chinese a more convenient route through Indian Kashmir to a port in Gujarat instead of Gwadar? It would have had exactly the same effect and be much less vulnerable to terrorist attacks and everything else. But somehow I don't think we offered that to the Chinese, and therefore now they've gone and built their road through Pakistan. It is potentially transformative of the China-Pakistan relationship. And if it works as envisaged, it will be transformative for Western China, because essentially it's going to reduce by 2/3 the cost of goods getting to Western China. Right now, the goods have to sail from the Gulf all the way past India, through the Straits of Malacca, into the South China Sea, into southern China, and then be transported by land all the way across China to Western China. They would essentially save 70% perhaps of transportation costs if they could actually be regularly, safely and efficiently moving goods through Gwadar directly up into Xinjiang. So it remains to be seen, but certainly their strategic vision is very clear. It's in their interests and therefore in Pakistan's interests. I can't say that directly it threatens us in any way. The well-being of the Chinese is a Chinese affair, not ours, one way or the other. But what bothers us is the violation of our sovereignty and the implied endorsement of Pakistan's territorial claims. The larger objection to BRI, General Narasimhan, of course, is not just on the sovereignty issue. We have pointed out that it has very severe consequences for the indebtedness of the recipient countries. And that this has now become very clearly apparent, because what people don't realize when Chinese announce these large sums of money in the billions of dollars is it's not grants. Very, very, very little of it is grants. I think of the Pakistani 67 billion, if I'm not mistaken, it's something between 3 and 7 billion that's just been given to the Pakistanis. Then there is a portion that is in a very low interest loan, something sort of well below market. But the bulk of it, over 40 billion of the Pakistani money, is actually from commercial financial institutions in China on commercial terms. And the Pakistanis are going to be carrying a crushing debt burden. And it is by no means at the moment clear that the CPEC will make enough money for the Pakistanis to both service that debt and return a net profit. So the Pakistanis may actually have taken on a rather large white Chinese elephant. We'll have to see. But other countries have already realized this. In the case of Sri Lanka, we've already seen the Chinese getting de facto control of a port in exchange for waiving interest payments that the Sri Lankans found unaffordable. Now, no self-respecting country wants to hand over its own territory, its own installations, its own infrastructure to a foreign country to run and control, but that's what's happening. And you can imagine many other smaller countries. The Chinese had similar designs on the Maldives, which would never have been able to afford what the Chinese were offering it. Now, with the new government in the Maldives, a break may come on that. But we're looking at all of this with some alarm, because, you know, a whole bunch of countries in our neighborhood who are financially head over heels in debt to China is not exactly something we in India can be terribly happy about. So that was on that side. The Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, only MPs could have come up with that, and I think that we will pat ourselves on the back. It's simply that it's something we live with as MPs in our constituencies all the time, and it struck us that, you know, if you've got a scheme that subsidizes the building of rural roads, and much of the terrain we're talking about in Arunachal, for example, is rural, therefore would qualify under PMGSY, but rather than having a rudimentary village road, have a road that's motorable and can take heavy vehicles, and you can also use it, and the locals have good roads. That was the logic of our recommendation. And then just to finish on the last point that our General Narasimhan made, the cleaning of rivers, agriculture and so on, our point is, not everything in a relationship between two big neighbors needs to be seen through the prism of strategic collaboration, competition, conflict. There are some aspects of the relationship that undoubtedly need to be developed further, much more than they have been, that you would have with any neighbor that you didn't have a problem with. Now, let us not see China only through the prism of problems. They have been effective at cleaning their own rivers. Why don't we invite their expertise here? I mean, you know, there's worry whenever Huawei comes in that they're putting secret sort of listening in devices into their telecom chips. I don't know. But you can't put much of a serious listening device into a river. So come in and help clean the river. I think that will be a good idea. In turn, we can offer them help in dairy. They very recently started a dairy industry. Chinese people particularly suffer from lactose intolerance, and so there's no great dairy culture there. But they've found some merit in doing all of this, and we could easily collaborate. They're going much farther afield to get help in developing dairy. We could offer them that help. When it comes to, here's Mohammed Salim. When it comes to agriculture, when it comes to my colleague Mohammed Salim from West Bengal, CPM, who is also a member of the committee and traveled with us also to the border. And so I'm afraid, Salim sir, we've had the first round of discussion already. Summarizing the report.
Stuck in the topic.
No, not to worry. We've summarized the main conclusions of the report. I'm issuing some clarification that General Narasimhan sought, and Mr. Bhattacharya will presumably have questions.
We're on the same page on this.
We're more or less on the same page on all of this. So that was broadly it. I mean, I think that that we feel there are things that could be developed that are non-political, non-controversial, non-strategic, but which could actually give some depth to the relationship. And that plus encouraging more connectivity, which was mentioned earlier, more contact between scholars, academics, tourists. There are Indian students in China, but very few Chinese students in India. I think we have something like 18,000 Indian students in China, not fully realized. We need to actually encourage more reciprocity from their side. The better we get to know each other, perhaps the less anxiety there needs to be about the intentions of each country vis-a-vis the other.
Mr. Salim, would you like to make some observations about the report, just to
You've missed what we've said already, but just to say,
I know, because since I was not present over here, and what Mr. Tharoor has told, that's because collectively we function in the committee, and he's a chairman, and he takes care of that. All views comes to the on the table, and ultimately it's a unanimous report. So, and particularly as far as foreign policy is concerned, and the relation between among the nations, and particularly with the neighbors, mostly in the post-independent India, we have almost unanimous views. Now, of course, for last 1 or 2 half decades, some things have developed. So, as far as Indo-China relation is concerned, and particularly Doklam, the country was one. Despite some fiery speeches and interventions in the television studios, putting fire in front of the panel, but our diplomatic initiative, our senior diplomats, they have played a very important role. Even when some quarters, Lieutenant General, forgive me, even some big high-sounding words were uttered by our military establishment here and there, as it was in the case of China also. Some experts, so-called experts in some writings, some write-ups came up, and media also played a role, not very responsible in that manner. And many diverse views came. But ultimately, it's a goli se nahi hua, boli se hua. And it's not that when something we discuss in Parliament and Parliament Standing Committee, in Parliament and the floor of the House, political views, political parties representation is there. But in the committee, even though we have some questions here and there, but ultimately it's not we work crossroads, we just work for the same purpose. So we also wanted that, but due credit to our diplomats, one. Secondly, the maturity of the leadership of both the countries, that we could avoid that. In any case, war between India and China is not going to resolve any problem as elsewhere, that create new problems. So during election campaign, we can thump our chest, we can see that we will enter into your borders and we will resolve all issues, but after election, the government also the leadership of the government also become very sober, and sometimes झूला में भी झूल लेते हैं, तो चुनाव में खुल के बोलते हैं, लेकिन जब झूलते हैं तो फिर रिस्पॉन्सिबली बिहेव करते हैं. तो इसलिए मैं समझता हूँ आज जहाँ तक रिपोर्ट हमने in the committee we decided that we want better relation despite all these irritants. Border disputes are there, undecided lines are there, and commission is there, and we have contact persons also. Let them sit more frequently, discuss it, not at the summit level, but those who actually function and work and can resolve and help us and do this homework, that is more important. But growing engagement in terms of business, trade, commerce, exchange of people to people exchange is needed, because a lot of doubts we have. Thanks to our earlier 62 experience, and then thanks to the Western world. Most of those thinkers who claim to be experts, the expertise come not from across the border, either this part or that part, but come from across the Atlantic Ocean. And that creates more problems.
Okay. Thank you.
So let us resolve the problem, seeing eye to eye, not surrendering our interest, but also not surrendering to the world power. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Salim. Just one question, since we talked a lot about Doklam. The report has this specific line on Doklam that the Chinese infrastructure in that region has still not been dismantled. And the report in a sentence says that, don't let your vigil down.
Yeah.
Is there anything more? I mean, how does one look at this? The fact is that Doklam may be passed and we are all very, very hopeful of things will get sorted out. But with the infrastructure not being dismantled, how serious is the concern?
It's not just not been dismantled, it's actually been reinforced.
Yeah.
And so as we said, there are permanent sort of constructions which can house a much larger number of people than were actually implicated in the standoff. There seems to be large barracks. You can house an infantry battalion in the infrastructure they have built. There's a helipad. There seems to be sheds for. I mean, it's possible the bulldozer simply gone into a shed.
Yeah,
We don't know, but there seem to be sheds for that kind of thing. I think it's very clear that if the Chinese were determined to do this, that they have reinforced themselves to a point beyond the numbers that were implicated in the standoff. I mean, we're talking platoon strength when the standoff occurred on both sides.
Yeah.
We also sent in
Yeah.
roughly a platoon, and they had about that. But today, they have the capacity to house, support and provision a much larger force should they be so inclined to do it. So obviously diplomacy plays a big part in ensuring they don't take that step. And there's always a perception, which even I must say indiscreetly that some of our military share, that some decisions are actually being taken by the local military commanders and need not necessarily signal a strategic choice by the political masters in Beijing, which is why the diplomacy shows them that there's a problem if they don't actually intercede from the political side. In this crisis, however, a number of things happened that had never happened before, not since '62. In particular, the resort to embarrassing attacks on India on Chinese television, which I've even seen some of their sort of shows. There was this ridiculous caricature with a Chinese actor putting on a beard and a turban to be an Indian, and and saying, you know, I'm your neighbor, but you are building a road in your garden. I don't like it. Take down the road. And that kind of thing. And the Chinese laughing at the Indians for objecting to their road and so on, which I must admit worried me that it was an escalation of rhetoric, which we had actually not seen. Even during that incident during President Xi's visit that we talked about, the Chinese media were largely silent. And it is basically a military action. Eventually was diffused either by the military itself or by orders from President Xi. They withdrew, they took away their tents, that was the end of that crisis. But the media in China hardly ever got involved. There was no big tom-tomming. On Doklam, which lasted 72 days and not just 6 or 7 as happened in that incident, you had a major amount of attacks on India. If you read the English language communist Chinese press, namely Global Times, the People's Daily, India was really vilified in quite an intemperate language. And Chinese TV, that was a new one, because Chinese TV normally steers clear of sensitive political information, except when the Chinese government wishes to make a point. So there was a perception that on this one, the Chinese government felt they had something at stake. So all credit, as Mohammed Salim said, to our diplomats for having defused it. Now, all remains to be seen as to whether this is merely the equivalent of a flexing of the muscle, or whether they are genuinely planning to do this at a more convenient moment for them. For example, when India is distracted with general elections, I don't know. We have to be on our guard. That's why we wrote that a vigil must be maintained.
Absolutely. There is also a mention in this report that India should try to exploit China's vulnerabilities in Southeast Asia. What was the committee was trying to hint at, and what kind of vulnerabilities can India exploit? Just as
I think you know what we mean. I mean, the fact is that parliamentarians can say things that no government would say. And so it was, we were exercising our freedom to be frank about something which obviously the government of India would never explicitly endorse. And when they give us their written comments on this report, I suspect that sentence will not be referred to. But obviously what we're talking about is, you know, if the Chinese can needle us on issues that bother us, we could use, for example, our stand on their difficulties with their neighbors in the South China Sea, our stand on their relationship with oil exploration in Vietnam, our views on the relationship between China and Taiwan. There are many, many areas in the neighborhood of China where India has been extremely obliging in echoing faithfully the Chinese stand on one country, two systems, on one China policy, all of those things, where a merely minor calibration of our position could cause some anxieties there. And it may just be a friendly warning saying, look, you know, stop irritating us and we'll stop irritating you. I mean,
has this idea been purchased? I mean,
not so far, but the committee is free to suggest
it.
And the government is free to decide whether or not they wish to take it further.
On Taiwan, you have the committee talks about that why the Indian government has accepted the Chinese sensibilities and decided to call it Chinese Taipei and only reduce relationship to trade ties. But a possibility of retaliation cannot be ruled out if you want to, the same way as the CPEC. So is that a realistic kind of a...
No, let me stress that on that one. In fact, please invite Mohammad Salim to also express a view because it may be slightly nuanced in relation to mine. Our view is this. The first point you quoted was merely an observation. It was not a criticism.
Sure.
That is something that most countries have done. Even the United States does not have an embassy. They have a trade legation. And the person heading it is actually usually somebody at the end of his career in the American Foreign Service and therefore technically retired from the Foreign Service when he's appointed head of that legation. Ours is different because we have our, as usual, we Indians are far too conscious of hierarchy. It's not a senior enough position for somebody who retires as an ambassador, so we send somebody who's joint secretary level as the head of our delegation. He does not retire from the service, but he is detached, in theory, to serve a trade job, though in practice he is de facto our ambassador there. Now, as General Narasimhan himself pointed out, we've had some interesting developments in recent years in the relationship with Taiwan. By the way, I myself went there during UPA, but not as a minister. I went during the period between my two ministerships when I was a backbencher, and as an MP again, I was free to go. And they had some very interesting conversations with various think tanks, universities, and privately also with members of the government. And indeed the opposition for that matter. They are a democracy and they're proud of it, and it's interesting to get a cross-section of views. What we were suggesting was that there are ways in which you can turn up the heat through that relationship. I mean, by doing things with them more publicly than you would otherwise do. See, the Chinese have had this very interesting relationship themselves with Taiwan. There is massive investment by Taiwan in China. The largest single place in which Taiwanese businessmen put their money is China. There is a lot of traffic between Taiwan and China. Chinese come in droves, and in fact, one Taiwanese saying to me, you'll be amused, the Chinese come from the mainland in large, they can't come as individuals. The Chinese organize tours. So they come in sort of busloads of people. They spend the whole day in the shopping malls of Taiwan, but they get home in the evening before prime time to sit before the television set and watch free political discussion in Chinese, because that's not possible in their country. So they just sit there and watch people speaking in Mandarin Chinese and arguing politics, because for them it's a completely new experience. Very interesting story. Then you've also got Foxconn coming here. We could quite openly now, at the moment, for example, we have some Indian students in Taiwan. We can encourage more to go. We send our diplomats for training to places like Hong Kong, in addition to the Chinese, Beijing, Shanghai, Canton, and so on. We have consulates where we do their language training in China. We could perhaps mischievously, but let it be known that we can send some to Taiwan.
So that's the way forward.
There are things we can do just to send a message to the Chinese, stop taking our goodwill for granted. Everything you want us for that matters to you, we have given you. And yet you treat us so badly on things that matter to us. You still give staple visas to people born in Arunachal Pradesh. And that too, sometimes you don't even give visas to them. You say that they're Chinese and they should apply for a Chinese passport. My former PS was born in Arunachal Pradesh. And they actually initially said that they will not give him a visa. He should apply for a Chinese passport. And fortunately, the government of India stood its ground and said either he comes or the entire visit gets called off and so on. And he was able to get a visa, but they gave it on a staple piece of paper. And this kind of thing is offensive and it's unnecessary. And our point of view is sometimes a little too benign in the view of the committee. I don't know if Salim Saab would agree.
Salim would like to come in on this issue?
No, I can't add on that. I can
differ
on that.
Sure.
I can subtract something.
Or modify.
You can say modify, or we have different perception. The advantage of Shashi Tharoor is that in this country, at least, because of our democracy, you can say a lot when you are in opposition, and if you join the government, you say the otherwise. So he has that advantage, but as left, I don't have that advantage. So we stick to opposition, whatever the government may be. And that we think, instead of disturbing our neighbors, destructing our neighbors, if we want to have a good relationship, we should not experiment what we did or Pakistan did with us. The cost of conflict we have paid for 70 years. The dividend of cooperation we should seek, and size matters. The size of economy of China, the size of military power of China, the size of the diplomatic and political clout China now engaged. Even erstwhile our friends, we have estranged and most of them have gone to that fold. So why there should be a pinprick? We must secure our own interest. We must seek our advantage, but not in the context of creating some minor irritants. Rather, to iron out those irritants and become friendly.
And if the Chinese don't want to iron out the irritants they're causing us?
You see, we have seen in Doklam also.
That's right. That's
Otherwise, a full-fledged war, some people were expected. We can't go to war with Pakistan. Mind it, I'm very frank in this.
That's right.
We can make use of during election campaign. So, face the reality.
That's right.
These two neighbors, China and India, even China also, if they want to sustain their development and come out of the present economic crisis, peace is the issue, not the war, one. And secondly, there are many such issues where cooperation can make us jointly the world leader. And the focus from Europe can come to Asia if we work together. But for that, we have to develop a congenial ecosystem instead of creating more irritations.
Thank you. Let me bring an army perspective to this debate. The committee welcomes defense cooperation initiatives by China. My question to you is, from an army perspective, are there anything that we need to be cautious or careful about before extending an unqualified welcome to such initiatives? I mean, what's your...
Like Mr. Tharoor said, there have been a number of defense cooperation arrangements that have already been on.
I'm saying, what are the lessons
ships have been making port calls. We have been doing hand-in-hand exercises with them. There is cross-training of officers, which goes on. The only thing that I would say is, I don't know whether it should be, you should put that question the way you put it, to say that we should be more cautious or otherwise. I think we should have more trust in ourselves. And we can actually do these kind of exchanges with them without any kind of hassle, because we can always take care of ourselves. It's not a big deal. So what it helps is actually to understand each other a little better. And we have also had actually exercises across the border, in not hand in hand, but across the border in Ladakh we had exercises with them. So these are all slowly basically confidence building measures to understand each other better, so that the kind of face-off that you see in patrolling, etc., which happens along the border, comes down a little bit. And this actually helps in better border management. So to that extent, I would say that defense cooperation arrangement should continue, and we should expand it as much as we can, and then see how things happen on ground. I think it helps better. When I was commanding the brigade in Nathula, we started having these exchanges coming up. Like on our Independence Day or Republic Day, we used to invite them. They used to call us on the National Day. That exchanges were really good. It helped in portraying our own culture to them. In fact, we used to have one state depicted in each of these occasions, and that culture depicted to them, to say that how diversified our country is, but still we are one, and we'll be able to look after ourselves. So it helps in making each other understand better, and it definitely helps in better border management. So I would say that defense cooperation arrangement should continue, and those programs should expand as we can, as much as we can accommodate it.
Okay, before you go into the audience and get them some questions from there, I have one final question to the chairman actually. In the section on India-China's economic cooperation, you have put a figure of $5 billion of foreign investment from China. But as we all know, Chinese investments don't come from China mainland. Chinese investments actually come, I think several times more investment from China come to different countries, from Singapore, from other Malaysia. So, I mean, would it have helped understanding this India-China economic cooperation if we have got the more correct and more realistic figure on Chinese investment in India?
It's extremely difficult to break down, you see, because in the government figures, those figures will show up as Singapore investment or Malaysia investment or whatever. They won't show up as
the
Chinese interests in those countries. I think, you know, where clearly there is room for improvement is things like more Chinese involvement in projects in India. They do have an extremely impressive execution capacity. And we have been hamstrung to a great extent by our security fears. Let's be very blunt about that. What was interesting, however, was that this government, the Modi government, lifted the UPA era restrictions that prevented Chinese companies from bidding for ports, telecoms, and one other major infrastructure area. I can't remember which now. But the Modi government lifted all restrictions, so they're free to invest and come into anything.
But still subject to Home Ministry clearance.
Yeah, but
still
oddly enough,
subject
they
to
have
Home
not bid.
Ministry.
You know, I don't think that, because if the Home Ministry had stopped, say, Huawei bid, it would have made it to the papers.
Yeah.
I don't think that they have actually chosen, in some cases, to bid in projects where there might be natural investors. Certainly the power sector would have been one, but this government has this extremely unrealistic view that our power situation is sufficient, ignoring the catastrophic failures of distribution of power. So many people, in Lutyens, Delhi, I get 5 power cuts a day in my home in Lodi Road. So I'm just surprised that the government goes around thinking we don't have a power problem. But I do want to say that as far as the economic cooperation is concerned, there is a different kind of problem, which the committee has also mentioned that you didn't quote, which is the extraordinary imbalance in the terms of trade.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's almost colonial.
That's a well-known story.
Where they're sort of taking our raw, for example, they have massive deposits of iron ore in China.
Yeah.
But they find it cheaper to import our iron ore, draining us of our iron ore, and sell us back finished steel products.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost colonial terms of trade.
There's also an access issue there.
And
Access
the
to
balance, you know, of the $70 billion when we wrote the report, I think it was 51 Chinese exports to India.
That's right.
And 19 India to China. Many Indian industries have really collapsed in the process. Yeah. For example, essentially the indigenous dyeing, D-Y-E, I-N-G business has died, essentially because cheaper chemical dyes from China have taken over, whereas many of our organic and natural dyes, which part of our traditional culture as well, have gone. The demonetization also helped drive many of these small and micro enterprises into extinction. So we are partly to blame ourselves, but certainly Chinese exports came in handy and it became unviable to compete. You have an extraordinary Chinese capacity for manufacturing, which surely we can learn from. We've got to a point now where apparently there are more Ganesh idols available in India that are made in China than are made in India. And as a collector of Ganesh idols, I'm somewhat mortified to know that I'm now contributing to the Chinese economy. There's a lot of this that I think that we need to wake up to. So my own view is we do need more Chinese involvement in some sectors of our economy. But at the same time, we need to wake up and see why the Chinese aren't allowing us access to their markets to do things that we can do better.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
in your words, we import Ganesha and export Lakshmi.
Well said. I think Mr. Modi's friends would appreciate that analogy.
Yeah.
Basically, the report also actually distinguishes between two types of investment that the Chinese are doing. The Foreign Secretary statement in the report says that for doing projects, they're more willing to come in. $63 billion worth of projects is what they are doing. Whereas if you want direct investments, then that becomes a huge issue.
No, but projects, we pay them to do the project.
Yeah, that's right.
We're talking about Chinese bringing money in and doing
And second thing is, the kind of investment that they do. Most of them are assembling plants, etc. The original manufacturing doesn't take place here. You need to get that in. That is what, at the moment, the work is on that.
That's right. Yeah. So, questions from the floor? Okay. Go ahead. Please identify yourself and ask a question to one of the panelists.
Yeah, I'm a Professor Lava from Delhi University, basically.
Sorry, which university, sir?
Delhi University.
Delhi University, great. Do hold the mic a bit closer.
Yes.
It's on.
I don't think it's making enough sound.
Oh, he's making noise. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm from Delhi University, basically, retired from Delhi University. When I was a student, I read a beautiful poem, Then I became a teacher and I had to teach that poem. A Robert Frost poem I'm referring to. Good fences make good neighbors. 4 months back, I'm coming to your point that everybody referred to. 4 months back, I came from my neighboring country after teaching at Royal University of Bhutan for 2 years. Our Mr. General Narasimha Rao knows that our IMTRAT is there. We are building their roads, GRIP, and we are building their buildings. And 90% of their GDP is Indian money. 90%. And I was shocked to learn all this when I was there for 2 years, and I discussed this continuously with people. And what the impression I got was, from both the parties, and I want you to say yes or no, that we are doing all this because we are afraid of China.
No, sir, I beg to disagree.
I also beg to disagree.
I think we're doing all this because this is a neighbor that we value. We have a very, very good relationship. They have been major supporters of ours in international forums. No, but we're contributing all that partly in our self-interest, but partly genuinely because we want to help this friendly neighbor. I mean, let's face it, we are doing not perhaps as much percentage of GDP, but we're also doing substantial amounts of assistance in Sri Lanka, in the Maldives, in Nepal. Bangladesh, yes, but perhaps slightly less. I mean, the point is that we're doing all of this both because it's good policy in the neighborhood, and certainly it's to our interest to retain the goodwill of these countries. The Bhutanese, there is a segment of Bhutanese opinion. Democracy is relatively new in Bhutan. Opinions are now being expressed with greater vehemence that would like to open up much more to China. And they are asking themselves, can we afford such overwhelming dependence just on India? Should we not have one more set of sources to bring us investment, bring us possibilities and so on? It's very interesting, that the Bhutanese, as you know, are very deeply Buddhist people, and a particular variant of Buddhism that they practice.
The Dalai Lama has never been there.
No, I'm not sure.
Nyingma sect is different. They follow the Nyingma tradition.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just one aspect to that. See, we entered into an Indo-Bhutan treaty much before these relationships went bad.
That's right, 1950.
1949 is the time we went into a treaty, and that time this consideration was not there. So to put that in perspective, that may be a better way of looking at it. Okay.
It's a pleasure to have you, Salim-ji. Was that entry of yours a little late strategically? So, I mean, because you brought in a new angle, which SHASHI being the guy who's moderating and likes to keep everything consensual. The point you made was shifting borders. You said that the pressure is not necessarily India versus China, and the border is not necessarily at Doklam or that little line that we see, but it's actually moved. Because when we talk markets and we talk competition, the war then becomes different. And India knows very well that technologically we're probably not where we should be to entertain the kind of stuff that the Chinese can make at the prices that they can make. So my question is, would this report have been read by them? Would the cooperation that we're talking about possible under these circumstances where China thinks that India is a capitalist bogey, whereas they think they are communist, when actually they are not. They're the largest capitalist country today. How can we change this perception, either through these reports, through media, to say that, look, we are both equally capitalist, let's have equal competition, which would be the best cooperation we can possibly have. How would you like to go about that? SHASHI, your views.
No, I'd much rather have it.
He will. But first thing is, strategically, I'm not late, but tactically, the meeting was advanced.
Okay, so tactically, how would you go about telling them that competition is possible because we are both capitalist countries, despite democracy and communism?
We make friendship not to change perception of the friends. Friendship between individual, between communities or countries. It's an individual perception we respect and we try to make friendship.
No, but they don't see themselves as capitalists.
They
say we are a communist country.
You can become friends only if you change your perception. I don't agree with that.
Mr. Tharoor? Would you like to?
I mean, you know, yeah, I mean, this, what Mohammed Salim is saying is right. And I mean, I think, what was it, Mr. Rabin in Israel famously said, you know, you make an effort with your enemies, not with your friends. And ultimately, it's precisely because of the potential for conflict and adversarial relations that there is an argument for diffusing that through more dialogue and more cooperation. And there I think we're all on pretty much common ground. There will be differences of detail and of nuance, and certainly I accept my friend Salim's suggestion that if I were in government, I may not be speaking quite the language I've spoken this evening, where I've said a few things that in government we would not say. Let's be very blunt. But that's partly because with government you carry a certain weight, a certain responsibility, which in opposition or as a member of parliament you are freed of. And I think that's part of democracy. In democracy we can say the unsayable from a government's point of view, and the government can hear it and act on it as it judges best. But to my mind, our dialogues with the government, as I said, there were very extensive sessions, were actually throughout conducted with a great deal of constructive candor. And I think neither was left in any doubt that there were any illusions about relation. When we speak about friendship between any two countries, there is behind the bonhomie a certain cynicism or reserve or realism that is felt on both sides. And we should be aware how they're looking at us, and they should be aware how we're looking at them. And despite that, we should want to have good relations, friendly relations. That's essentially, and that applies to all countries, not just these two.
Yeah.
Well, greetings, Mr. Tharoor. Always a pleasure hearing from you.
Thank you. He's a good friend from the MEA days. Now retired, I think, no?
Well, I've just retired, as 2 years ago. So thank you very much for the refreshing and very eloquent perspective which you have given us. I just have one question. While we have always have 200 to 400 incursions every year across the border, reported or not reported, there's a new pattern emerging in the last 5 years. Before any high-level engagement on either direction, there is a manufactured crisis or a crisis that is manufactured by China. Whether it was Depsang in 2013, Schumer in 2014, or Doklam in 2017. So what is your perspective in particular, or committee's perspective, on this particular development? Is it here to stay? What are they trying to do? How should we read it?
Well, I'd say that what we've said in the report, which obviously the entire committee has agreed to, is that we do sense that China uses the unsettled nature of the border between the two countries to occasionally manufacture a crisis in order to throw India off balance, for the reasons best known to them. Now, we may, in fact, by saying that, we may be giving the Chinese more sort of credit than they deserve for being a monolithic decision-making entity. I have friends who tell me that it may not be like that. That, for example, the 2014 incident happened when Xi Jinping was yet to fully consolidate his control over the military, and that it may well have been an exercise by a military commander to test the PLA's relative power vis-a-vis the civilian authority. In the showdown, the civilians won, but in the meantime, India-China relations became a casualty. In 2017, however, we definitely got the sense that it went all the way to the top. And indeed, the resolution also had to come all the way from the top, because the negotiations took place not between militaries, but between diplomats. So there again, it's difficult to escape the feeling that the Chinese were doing this on purpose, that they really did want to. Now, it could be that the southern commander acted unilaterally, and then the central government felt they had to back him up or the Chinese would lose face. These are all calculations that can only be known to those within the decision-making apparatus in Beijing. But we as outsiders and at the receiving end, have one view which may not reflect all the calculations that have gone into the actions on that side. The committee also concluded, as I mentioned earlier, that a real effort has to be made by India to settle the underlying problem, which is to demarcate the border. That we feel that as long as it remains unresolved, it will constantly give an excuse to people to create trouble from their side, and that since we don't want that to happen, because it is a genuine problem, we have to make a serious effort of sustained talks. Right now, the special representatives meet sporadically, and I've spoken to our special representatives at various stages. Nothing much seems to transpire, and the Chinese appear to come without any serious desire to move things forward. We may need to ask them now. Actually, I can tell you of a private conversation, because it was private, on a ferry boat on the Moscow River, with my counterpart, the head of the Chinese Foreign Relations Committee, who is herself a former ambassador to London and a fairly senior Communist Party member, but not in the Politburo. And she said to me that she was under the impression that India didn't want a solution. I said, why do you think not? And she said, well, because no progress has been made. Every time we talk, we say the same things, we go away. And I said, but that's our perception is exactly the opposite. We have the perception that it is you. And then I quoted to her a few famous statements by Chinese leaders, including the one about waiting for future generations for the time to be ripe and so on. And I said, nobody in India is saying, let's wait for future generations. We want to solve it. So, nothing came of that conversation, which was now 3-4 years ago. But I just want to say that, that if there are some people in the Chinese establishment who think we don't want to move with the necessary urgency, then I would say that the next government after May should actually move on a footing that we convey that for us, it is a priority, and for them, they really need to formulate a position. What do they want out of the border? In fact, if you talk to our military friends, and you should ask General Narasimhan this, there are only a half a dozen points along the border, plus of course the big question about Arunachal Pradesh, but otherwise half a dozen points around the border where there's a dispute. Much of the lines can be demarcated without pain. Right. But where the dispute is, we now have a situation where, as you say, 400 incursions a year, not because our people are worried about them, but because there's an informal understanding that on Monday we will patrol where we think the border is and you please leave us alone. And on Tuesday you patrol where you think the border is and we leave you alone. And there's been no shooting, as you know, since 1976 along the India-China border. However, there's been a disturbing increase in the number of incidents where guns are pointed at each other. And there was this brawl you know the name of the place, which was unfortunate because it was also on YouTube. I mean, somebody filmed the blessed thing, and there are Indians and Chinese going after each other with bare hands, rather bare hands than guns, definitely, but still, it was very unseemly. And all of this need not happen if everyone knew where we stood. So I think we need to convey, and I certainly firmly believe we must convey to the Chinese that we're serious about moving rapidly. And if they want to convey they're not interested, then let the world see that. But right now, there is this rather macabre sort of dance, this theater going on, where both sides meet, they talk, they exchange pleasantries and gifts, and they go away, and nothing has been achieved in 26 rounds of talks.
So isn't this very surprising that you have a record number of 11 top leadership level meeting the last 4.5 years, and in spite of this lack of understanding of positions between the two countries?
Unfortunately, in the last few years, it looks like we have been going along with what the Chinese want out of these meetings. When we have issues we want to raise with them, whether it's Masood Azhar in New York or it's the Doklam of sorts, and then they say we'll have a no agenda meeting and we acquiesce in that. Oh, it's their agenda not to have an agenda. We should be putting things out on the agenda.
That's the statement of the evening.
Absolutely.
Professor Muni?
Just to add to one point.
One question, sorry.
All this question of this 400 intrusions, etc., not intrusions, I would say face-off that take place, can be actually resolved if the LAC is
dropped. Yeah.
Border solution can come later, but the LAC should be marked on ground so that we understand the position of each side, and that is not actually progressing well.
Yes, Professor Muni, yeah.
On the needling question, Tibet never occurred to the committee. Is there a room for revisiting India's Tibet policy, not in terms of questioning one China, but in terms of raising the cultural issue, the human right issue, at least telling them that they should talk to Dalai Lama and resolve this, because this is one of the irritant between the two, whether it is so sad or not.
Well, I mean, let's be very candid amongst each other. As far as Tibet is concerned, the Chinese biggest worry is not India, it's the Dalai Lama. Their consolidation of power over Tibet has also been augmented by a massive infusion of Han Chinese, who I am told in some accounts are now a demographic majority in Tibet. they have absolutely not a shred of doubt that their control over Tibet is absolute and cannot be challenged. Their worry is, of course, that but those are the Tibetan Buddhist officials working for the Chinese, of whom there are many, because obviously people have to live, and you know the Chinese are a reality in your land. You will serve. Yeah. So the real problem is essentially the Chinese are worried that when the Dalai Lama goes, he's, as you know, in his 80s and fragile, that there will be an attempt made by enemies of China to create a new Dalai Lama who will be out of their control. They had hoped to solve, quote unquote, the Dalai Lama problem the same way they solved the Panchen Lama problem, which is if some reincarnated Lama is found, they will kidnap him and indoctrinate him, and if he's not obliging, they will anoint another one whom they will find, and he will be brainwashed in Beijing till he's 15, 16, 17, and then be unleashed on the world as the unchallenged Dalai Lama. But as long as there is a credible community in the diaspora, there is always a problem of a rival claimant. Now, obviously a rival claimant born in Mysore or Los Angeles is going to lack credibility. But the sixth Dalai Lama was born in Tawang, in what is today Arunachal Pradesh. And therefore, it's an entirely appropriate territory for a later Dalai Lama to re-emerge. Now, the present Dalai Lama has said all sorts of statements. He said, there may not be another Dalai Lama, reincarnation might end. He said there might be a Dalai Lama identified in my own lifetime. He has said that Dalai Lama may well be born and may be found in a couple of years' time. I mean, he has made so many statements that no one really is very clear as to what his particular final stand is on this matter. But the Chinese do worry a lot that there will be a Dalai Lama out of their control, groomed in India, who would potentially be once again a locus of Tibetan opposition, resistance, global support and everything else. And you can well imagine...
Mysticism worries them. I mean, this kind of mysticism that there'll be another mystical guy.
Well, non-Tibetan Buddhism has actually revived significantly in China. There is a tremendous... In fact, what's interesting is many of the very rich Chinese, the rich capitalist Chinese, have actually become sources of funding for Buddhist activities outside China. Because for them, they've seen this as somehow buying them virtue. And there are NGOs, I can be very honest and say that in my visit to Bhutan, I came across a Bhutanese Buddhist group that was planning to travel to China to raise some money for themselves. Because they said the money is there. They want to give money to Buddhist causes. So you can be sure that, that China does worry about the appeal of religion. They have kept the Catholic Church under control by appointing their own bishops. That seems to be easing slightly. As far as the Buddhist community is concerned, by and large, it's been clamped down upon. But the question of the next Dalai Lama remains. Right now, you can be sure that when he passes away, the Chinese will announce triumphantly within a few months that they have found a miraculous infant who has identified all the right signs. They will wheel out 2 or 3 lamas to authenticate it, and that child will then be sent off for education to Beijing and not heard from again for 15 years. But all of that could be seriously undermined if a Dalai Lama emerges from the diaspora in India, and particularly from a place like Tawang or that area, which has produced an unchallenged Dalai Lama in the past. These are all issues the Chinese truly worry about. And I think that certainly from India's point of view, if you have a good, peaceful India-China relationship, they may worry less. But that is the one Tibetan card we have. And I would be very reluctant, if I were in government, to let go of that card. I think we have continually taken the view that we don't support the Dalai Lama as the head of a political movement or an exiled government. We recognize him as a spiritual leader. But once he passes away, who's going to be the spiritual leader? These are things that I hope some cynic experts in our foreign ministry are thinking about very, very seriously, because these are choices we'll have to make any time in the next few years.
Okay, I think we have run out of time. We have time for just 2 questions. One question from here, and the last question will be the lady.
So my name is Shantam. I'm a teacher in the Zen Buddhist lineage, which comes from China, originally from India. And it's sort of linked partly to this because our oldest cultural relations are with China through Buddhism. And I haven't read the report, unfortunately, so I wasn't sure whether you'd alluded to this, but you've spoken a little bit about this, and whether we can actually link again through that route, through the soft power, the cultural power we were talking about. It's very potent. And what I'm worried about right now is that China is actually very deliberately taking the center space of Buddhism in the world. And India's never claimed it, but India had it. But China is taking it and deliberately taking it with large world conferences. And India is also just, excuse my saying, making a bit of a mess with the Karmapa issue recently and things like this. So I'd really like to know whether that came in the report at all and whether we can see this as a path of cooperation, but also seeing strategically how China is really deliberately taking that, trying to make China the Mecca for Buddhists.
I think it came very briefly. In the soft power report 2 years earlier, we did mention the World Buddhist Conference and applauded that initiative, the one we had held. But as you say, the Chinese have gone way ahead of us in that regard. And I personally am of the view that we could do much better with using or leveraging Buddhism as a source of influence with a number of countries. And resources would have been forthcoming, not just from China, but from Japan and elsewhere, for developing the infrastructure of tourism, for example, which is now happening, Gaya in particular. But I think perhaps a lot more could have been done. I don't disagree with you. And Salim Saab, when you were not here, the point was made that perhaps we could have made more of the whole cultural diplomacy, soft power argument in our report. We have only mentioned it very briefly, and it could have been a fuller, it could have been treated more.
That should be your core strength.
Yeah.
That's right. The last question.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Geeta Kushal and I teach Chinese in Jawaharlal Nehru University. It was very interesting to hear for the first time really that we really need to solve China-India border in the proactive manner as it is possible. And I was thinking that when we talk about India's connections in border, most of the borders are quite fragile and open and porous in that sense. But when we see the Chinese, solution of borders, it is more like rigid checkposts. So are we considering that if we want to solve that, we are going to have rigid borders? And secondly, that when you're thinking about the Doklam and the possibility that another Doklam can happen, we see that China is quite actively engaging with the Bhutanese to resolve their border dispute. And suppose, maybe in a year or two, or maybe in 4 or 5 years, if China is able to resolve the border problem with Bhutan, then the road construction that is already on the way will not, challenge the sovereignty of India, and how we are going to deal with that. Thank you.
That's a lot of questions.
3 questions.
Yeah, I mean,
you can be brief. No, I think.
Unfortunately, I have to leave for a meeting myself.
The session has to end. Already we are running out of time. So please.
Certainly, I mean, the fact that the border needs to be moved on expeditiously, we all agree. That does not necessarily mean rigid checkpoints, as you said, because ultimately the good fences make good neighbors policy means that once you have clarity on where your lines stop, you can also have trade routes, land routes, other connectivity across in various strategic points. As I mentioned early on, before Salim Saab came, historically there's been a lot of trade with areas of the region that are now part of China, that were not always necessarily under Chinese suzerainty, but now are, and there's no reason why we shouldn't restore a lot of those land routes, trade routes for travel, for trade, modest levels of trade amongst the local communities, and so on and so forth. So I don't think that drawing a border necessarily means it's going to be impermeable. It just means that you won't have misunderstandings anymore because you know where you live, but you'll certainly be free to set up routes and roads and tracks and rail lines across them. On the, what was your second question? So you asked 3 questions. So that's, that was the second question. Okay, I thought that was the third. So on that one, the Bhutanese, partly because of the treaty with us, will keep us fully informed of their negotiations. You seem to be implying that there might be a settlement between Bhutan and China, which will render this disputed territory into Chinese hands. I think that's unlikely to happen without deep consultation with India and without India seeking and receiving some assurances. Because as I said, the only value to China of that piece of land is the ability to dominate the Jamperi Ridge and Indian territory. There is no other purpose. So we are naturally going to ask ourselves the question, why do the Chinese want that territory? I mean, you know, there's no other value. There's literally nothing there. It is ice half the year and grass the other half. There's literally nothing else. So we have to ask ourselves why the Chinese want it, and the Bhutanese are asking. Now, if the Bhutanese say, look, it's in our national interest to settle this, we want to settle it, maybe some sort of three-cornered negotiation would have to take place where the Chinese give us an ironclad assurance not to build a multiple road, or not to build a road that could be used by tanks or armored vehicles or whatever. I don't know. But at this stage, I don't think this is on the cards. Certainly the Bhutanese have not implied to us that they're rushing off to give away that bit of land. So for the moment, it remains, from our point of view and the Bhutanese point of view, Bhutanese territory. And India has every strategic interest in ensuring that it does remain Bhutanese territory. But a settlement of the border in the end should ideally also include a settlement of the China-Bhutan border too.
Thank you very much. I think we have come to the end of this session. I think I will not try to sum up the discussion that we had. It's a rich discussion, and I think it's been rarely have we got a chairman of a parliamentary committee who can add so much more to the report that is already in your hands. So I think we must compliment Mr. Tharoor and General Narasimhan, Mr. Salim, for being with us and shedding more light on this committee's report and its implications. And thank you very much to all of you to being here, and we close the session at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, how are you?
Where's your card?